All right. Shalom, everyone. What a beautiful day, right? The title of my presentation is the Hebrew Manuscripts of the Brit Kadasha. But I would like to start with a prayer, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
To the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I ask that my words during this teaching reflect your truth and not my own desires for the truth. Let it be a blessing for all who hear it. Let it contain at least one new fact, previously unknown or misunderstood, for all those observing the Feast of Tabernacles. We ask these things in the mighty name of Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen. Amen. The subject that I'm going to discuss is controversial, so I'll tell you that up front. I'm going to make an argument that some of the books of the Brit Kadasha were originally written in Hebrew and not in Greek. The three books that I leaned on for this presentation, I have them here. The Sons of Zion versus the Sons of Greece by Dr. Miles Jones. The Messianic Church Arising by Dr. Miles Jones. And The History of Jewish Christianity by Hugh Schoenfield.
Yeah.
For the last 1,600 years, we have been told that there is no such thing as a Hebrew version of any of the books of the Brit Kadasha. Western seminaries teach theologians several years of Greek versus several minutes of Hebrew because they largely ignore the Tanakh and focus most of their time on the New Testament. Dr. Miles Jones and the Benei Emunah Institute, BEI, have been working for the last 30 years to uncover and translate Hebrew manuscripts of the Brit Kadasha. Myself, Sean and Leslie Vesey, and Jackie Pittman are volunteers at BEI currently, and we are helping to translate the book of Luke currently. BEI has already published 3 books of the Brit Kadasha translated from Hebrew manuscripts. I have those books here as well if you want to look at them later. We have the Hebrew book of Matthew, the Hebrew book of Revelation, and the Epistle of James, Yaakov.
Oh, yes.
I would like to start with a brief history of the English translation of the Bible. The Council of Nicaea. The council met from May 325 AD through July 325 AD in the city of Nicaea. The council was called by the Roman Emperor Constantine I. The council accomplished a number of things. Among them, they established canon law. Part of canon law established the criteria for the books to be included in the Bible. For a book to be considered as canon, it must meet certain criteria. First of all, it has to be an apostolic authority. In other words, an apostle of Yeshua or closely associated with him. Number 2, it has to be considered orthodoxy. In other words, it cannot contradict accepted doctrine. And number 3, it has to be universal. It has to have universal acceptance, which means it's widely used and recognized. Although it ultimately resulted in differences between Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant canon, it was truly the beginning of what we today call the Brit Kadasha. The process took about 3 years to confirm all the current books. Prior to the Brit Kadasha was a collection of Greek, Aramaic, and Messianic Hebrew manuscripts. Probably no 2 groups in the entire world had the same collection. Next, Jerome and the Vulgate. Jerome of Stridon was born between 342 and 345 AD. He died September 30, 420 AD. Jerome was a scholar and priest who was fluent in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. Pope Damasus of the Church of Rome commissioned Jerome to translate Scripture into Latin in 385 AD. In 405 AD, he finished the Vulgate Bible, which was the first complete Bible created using Hebrew manuscripts translated into Latin. Prior to the Vulgate, the Vestus Latina was used, but it was based on the Septuagint. Jerome testified in writing 4 separate times that he translated the Hebrew Gospel, referring to the Gospel of Matthew. Jerome made 24 references to and quotations from the Hebrew Gospel. Pope Damasus was not happy about the use of the Hebrew Gospel as a source for the Latin Vulgate, but Jerome judged it as essential. He said, "You urge me to revise the old Latin version, and as it were, to sit in judgment on the copies of the Scriptures which are now scattered throughout the whole world. And inasmuch as they differ from one another, you would have me decide which one of them will agree with the Greek original. We must confess that as we have it in our Greek language, it is marked by discrepancies. And now that the stream is distributed into different channels, we must go back to the fountainhead." The fountainhead Jerome is referring to is, of course, Hebrew. Jerome is a credible historical source. He was most famous for the book, the Chronicon, which was an ecclesiastical history of the early church. A significant portion of what we know today about the early church came from that writing. St. Augustine comments on Jerome's accomplishment were, "In our day, the priest Jerome, a great scholar and master of all 3 tongues, has made a translation into Latin, not from Greek, but directly from the original Hebrew. All of the early church fathers say Matthew was written in Hebrew. There are 76 attestations and 80 quotations in early Christian literature. No early Christian writer, denied a Hebrew Matthew. Who are some of the early fathers? Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis, 60 AD to 130 AD. Pantaenus, theologian. Clement of Alexandria. Hegesippus, father of church history. Hippolytus, theologian. Origen of Alexandria, theologian. Eusebius, bishop of Caesarea. And Ephraim the Syrian, just to name a few. Now let's fast forward 900 years. John Wycliffe and the Wycliffe Bible. John Wycliffe was born in England in 1320 AD, and he died on January 3rd, 1385 AD. He was called the Morning Star because he was the first prominent Protestant reformer. He was a Catholic priest, but he had issues with the fact that the Catholic Church veered into secular governance and had become very corrupt. He translated the Vulgate from Latin into English. He did this because he realized that less than 10% of English priests were fluent in Latin. In many cases, they just memorized the liturgy and did not even know what it meant. Also, he wanted common people to understand the Gospels, and he knew that the only way that that would happen is if it were written in their native tongue. Because he translated the Bible into English, he was so hated by the Roman Catholic Church that the Council of Constance in 1415 ordered that his body be dug up 44 years after his death, and his bones be burned into ash and scattered into the river Swift. They also condemned him as a heretic posthumously. They thought that it would symbolically erase his influence. The Wycliffe Bible was the first time that Europeans were able to read the Bible in their own tongue. Contrary to the adversary's goal, which resulted in the scriptures being translated into many languages. As we all know here, the Bible has been distributed to and read by more people than any book in the history of mankind. William Tyndale and the KJV. William Tyndale was born in 1494 AD, and he was murdered by the Roman Catholic Church in October 1536. William Tyndale was probably the greatest linguist that ever lived. He spoke 6 languages as well as native speakers. Tyndale translated the Tyndale Bible using Hebrew documents for the Tanakh and Greek documents for the Brit Kadasha. At BEI, we feel like we are helping to finish the work that was started by Tyndale by translating Hebrew manuscripts of the Brit Kadasha that were not available to him. The King James Version of the Bible was published in 1611 AD. 83% of the KJV was written by William Tyndale 75 years before it was published. Think about the extent to which the medieval Catholic Church went to prevent the use of English versus Latin. The truth is that the early Greek Catholic Church also favored Greek over Hebrew in the same way. If you have any doubts about that statement, think about what Justin Martyr said regarding the appointed times in the Tanakh. Christians do not need to observe the Jewish feast or the Sabbath, one of the very feasts that we are observing today. As a result, they created Christmas, Halloween, Easter, and St. Patrick's Day. Can you have any doubts that the same church would prefer Greek manuscripts to Hebrew manuscripts? Justin Martyr lived from 90 AD to 165 AD. And now a brief history of the Jewish diaspora. First and Second Jewish revolts. The first Jewish revolt against Rome started in 67 AD, and the Second Temple was destroyed by Rome in 70 AD on the 9th of Av. It was the same day that the Babylonians destroyed the First Temple. Before the Second Temple was destroyed, many Messianic Jews left Israel, spoken of by Yeshua in Luke 21:20 through 22. And when you shall see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Because believers in Yeshua knew this prophecy, a high percentage of Messianic Jews fled Jerusalem. The Jews that left during the first revolt initially went to Pella in Jordan. The second revolt of Jews against Rome was known as the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which took place between 132 and 135 AD. It was led by Simon Bar Kokhba. The non-Messianic Jews believed that he was the Messiah. The Messianic Jews who remained after the first rebellion knew that he was not and did not join the rebellion. Instead, they left Judea as well. This led to a hard split between rabbinical Jews and Messianic Jews. It is reasonable to believe that they took their scriptures with them and that they probably were written in Hebrew. The diaspora. Consider this point. From 30 AD to 60 AD, the followers of the Way were primarily Nazarenes. The Apostle Shaul, who was martyred in 64 AD, brought the Gospels to the Gentiles in the last 20 years of his life, which resulted in Greek primacy toward the end of the first century. So what happened to those early Jewish followers of Yeshua? A large group moved to Sepharad, Spain. Sepharad means land of the book. Sephardim means people of the book. I'm not saying that all the Jews that fled to Spain were Messianic, but a large group were. Next, the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition began in 1478 and lasted until October 31st, 1492. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree that ordered all Jews that were not willing to convert to Catholicism to be expelled from Spain. They could only keep what they could carry with them. There were between 200,000 and 300,000 Jews living in Spain at this time. One of those Messianic Jews was Christopher Columbus. He pretended to be Italian in order to find a land where Jews could worship without persecution. DNA has recently proved he was a Sephardic Jew. Many members of his crew were Jewish, and it is said they carried the Holy Scriptures on board with them. I bet that they were written in the Holy Tongue. When I lived in Cincinnati, there was a very large Italian-American club that celebrated Columbus every year as an important accomplishment of fellow Italians. With some amusement, I wonder if they are celebrating Columbus Day today, with the same fervor that they did before knowing Columbus was a Sephardic Jew. There are two books on the subject: Simon Wiesenthal's Sails of Hope, 1973, and Mike Evans' Christopher Columbus, Secret Jew, 2015. It is in India is another place that the Jews went to. It is believed by many that the apostles Thomas and Bartholomew spread the Gospels to India, and Thomas was martyred there. What sources confirm this? The apocryphal Acts of Thomas, the ecclesiastical history written by Eusebius, the doctrine of the apostles, Hippolytus of Rome, along with St. Jerome, St. Gregory, and St. Ephraim of Syria. Marco Polo, a 13th century traveler, wrote about visiting the Apostle Thomas's tomb in Mylapore. Origen recorded that Thomas and Bartholomew's mission assignments were to Parthia and northwest India. Origen was considered a major early Christian scholar who lived between 185 and 254 AD, which is the earliest mention that we currently know of. Pantaenus, visiting the Indies late in the 2nd century, reported that he found his own arrival anticipated by some, to whom Bartholomew, one of the apostles, had preached and had left them the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew. Now let's talk about a few of the Hebrew manuscripts. The HGC Vatican 100. This manuscript came from Catalonia, Spain. It left Spain during the Spanish Inquisition. It ended up in the library of the Vatican of Rome. It was hidden beneath a 100-page Hebrew book, The Tales of Sindabar, and it was discovered in 1956 during an in-depth analysis of Hebrew holdings. Now you think about it, had it not been for that book being on top, that would have been destroyed, and we would have never had that. The text was 304 pages, including the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in Hebrew, along with the prefaces to Matthew, Mark, and Luke by Jerome. The preface says the first evangelist wrote this in the Holy Tongue for the brothers. Next, the Cochin manuscripts. Claudius Buchanan, a Scottish minister and evangelist in Asia in the 1800s. While he was in Cochin, India, he discovered various manuscripts of the Hebrew Gospels and Berit Kadasha. They ended up in the University Library, Cambridge. They were discovered there by Dr. Miles Jones on December 5th, 2019. The documents included 4 forgotten manuals for a total of 585 pages. The manuscripts included the Hebrew Gospels, Acts, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, and Revelation. Dr. Jones also discovered a 5th set of documents at Ryland Library in Manchester. This manuscript included the following note: The volume contains an exact transcript of the four Gospels from the Hebrew copy of the New Testament brought from the Black Jews of Travancore by Dr. Claudius Buchanan and deposited in the University Library, Cambridge. Done from the original manuscript in Jerusalem, characters into sacred or square characters by T.Y. 1810. Buchanan discovered the documents in 1806 at the Synagogue of the Black Jews in Cogent. According to Eusebius, Bartholomew took a copy of the Hebrew Gospels to Cogent in the 1st century. In the 2nd century, Peneius, which was cited as returning from Cogent to Alexandria with a copy of the Hebrew Gospel. The Messianic community of Cogent preserved the Gospels for hundreds of years and added Greek epistles to complete the Brit Kadasha. Shem Tov. This manuscript was transcribed from Shem Tov Aben Shaprut, a 14th century Sephardic Jewish rabbi. He transcribed it in 1385. The book included 12 chapters discussing the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic Hebrew text of the Tanakh, along with the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. The chapter of Matthew was 75 pages. His motivation was to give rabbinical Jews the information they needed to debate with Christians. In 1995, George Howard translated the manuscript, which was the first English translation of a Hebrew Brit Kadasha book. There are 28 known copies of the original manuscript. Shem Tov planned to do the same for Mark, Luke, and John, but he never completed them. One thing I will tell you is that before George Howard translated that, if you went to a seminary and you mentioned this subject, they said they did not exist. They would tell you they flat out did not exist. So this was a shock to the seminaries. But of course they have explanations now, right? These are just the 3 examples. The Benei Emunah Institute has digital copies of about 80 manuscripts. There are probably less than 200 known to be in existence. Compare that to the Greek manuscripts, which number about 5,000. Clearly, the early Greek church and the Roman Catholic Church were very successful in destroying every Hebrew document they could find. So what are the differences between the Greek and Hebrew versions? Let me just say that theologically, there are no differences. What I have found is there are 3 categories of differences. First, errors of fact. Second, removing Hebrew influences. And finally, confusing syntax because of poor translations. By that, I mean the Greek version is confusing compared to the Hebrew version. I truly believe that God is not a God of confusion. He wants us to clearly understand His Word. If you translate a document from Hebrew to Greek to English, that creates more opportunities for confusing syntax than just simply translating it from Hebrew to English. The Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. The Imperial Library of Constantinople was the last and greatest of antiquity. It was destroyed by fire in 473 AD, and some 120,000 texts and scrolls were damaged or destroyed. It was rebuilt, and many of the texts were recovered and recopied. In 1204 AD, the Franks sacked the city and ravaged the library. Many of the scrolls on papyrus had degenerated and were rewritten on parchment. The process was expensive. The curator of this project, Nicephorus Xanthopoulos, in 1320 AD, recorded this to determine the cost. The Revelation of John, 1,400 lines. The Revelation of Peter, 300 lines. The Epistle of Barnabas, 1,260 lines. The Gospel of the Hebrews, 2,200 lines. Nicephorus noted that the Hebrew Gospel is 300 lines less than the canonical Matthew in Greek, which means that there was also a Hebrew copy of the book of Matthew in the Imperial Library of Constantinople in 1320 AD. The lintel versus the curtain. Greek versions say that when Jesus was crucified, the curtain in the temple was torn. The Hebrew versions say that the lintel was broken. According to Webster, a lintel is a horizontal architectural member, spanning and usually carrying the load above an opening. What does the KJV say about this incident? Matthew 27:51. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from top to bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. Now let's look at what the HJC Catalonia version says. And here the temple was broken on both sides, up and down, and the earth quaked, and the stones split in the middle. So which one is correct? A good method to determine the correct version is to ask, are there multiple citations? And secondly, are there independent historical confirmations? There were 3 instances in Jerome's translation of the Vulgate. He preserves the scenario of breaking of the temple lintel rather than tearing of the temple curtain at the crucifix of Jesus. And he did this in Matthew 27:51, Mark 15:38, Luke 23:45, which means the Hebrew versions of these books also existed prior to 405 AD when he wrote it, right? An additional reference is the Gospel of the Nazarenes. We read that at the time of Messiah's death, the lintel of the temple of immense size had split. Josephus says the same and adds that awful voices were overheard, which said, "Let us depart from this abode." Finally, according to the Talmud, 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin was removed from the chamber of hewn stones in the temple and convened in the marketplace. The chamber of hewn stones was where Sanhedrin met, and they were never able to return to that chamber. The judgment made by the official Sanhedrin against Yeshua within their chambers was the last time that they ever made a judgment against anyone. And I can tell you that the chamber of hewn stones was only 40 feet from the Holy of the Holies. In fact, it was less than 40 feet from the Holy of the Holies. Next example, Luke 6:38. This is something I've personally worked on, Luke 6:38. This is an example of where the verse is much clearer when translated from Hebrew than from Greek. KJV. Give, and it shall be given unto you, good measure, pressed down and shaken together and running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that ye mete withal, it shall be measured to you again. The Hebrew translation. Give, and I will give you a good measure. Give a just measure, and I will give you a gift of higher measure in the end. For the same measure that you measure, it will be measured to you, and it will be given to you according to the same measure. To me, that's a lot clearer. I mean, I understand that better. The next example is intentionally removing the Jewishness of the Scriptures. Keep in mind that the theology of the Brit Kadasha is based on the Tanakh. I want to give you one very subtle example of how replacement theology can be enforced with seemingly innocent changes to the Scriptures. Our basis in this example comes from the Tanakh, Exodus 25:31. And you shall make a menorah of pure gold. Matthew 5:15, KJV. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the houses, or they're in the house. Matthew 5:15, the Hebrew translation. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a menorah, in order to enlighten everyone in the house. Also think about many other obvious examples. Jesus versus Yeshua, James versus Yaakov, Peter versus Kepha, just to name a very few. Conclusions. What books of the Brit Kadasha were originally written in Hebrew? We do not believe that every book of the Brit Kadasha was originally written in Hebrew. Some were written in Hebrew, some in a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic, not unlike Spanglish here in the U.S., and some were written in Greek. And it's at least possible that one was written in Latin. The books that were most likely originally written in Hebrew were Matthew, James, Jude, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, Hebrews, Revelation. And at least heavily influenced by the Gospel of Matthew are Luke, Acts, and Mark. I can't tell you that with 100% certainty that this list is accurate. The only way we can be sure is to find every Hebrew manuscript that still exists, translate and analyze them. Think about this. Those scribes that preserved these manuscripts risked their very lives to preserve the Word of God. Rabbinical Jews disowned them, and anti-Semitic Gentiles persecuted them. The truth is, they were Yeshua's Jewish remnant, not unlike those God spoke of to Elijah in 1 Kings 19:18. Yet I have preserved 7,000 in Israel, whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and whose mouth has not kissed him. I consider it a blessing from God to have the opportunity to translate these manuscripts. I leave you with this from the Apostle Shaul, Romans 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the Gospels of Yeshua HaMashiach, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Thank you.